Hey guys, welcome back for our second video for our skeletal system here in anatomy. We're going to go ahead and jump into a little bit of bone naming structures and some different things here today before we get to tackling this task of just learning the names and identifying features on all of these bones in the skeleton. So let's start here. Bones are an organ, and they're made up of bone, which is the obvious part, but that's not it. This kind of dried bone picture you think of as bone is not very close to what the real living thing looks like. There's also cartilage around this bone. There's dense connective tissue on bone. There's blood running along the outside and the inside of bone. Of course, there's blood vessels to carry it. There are nerves running through the bone, and there's even epithelial tissues lining parts of that bone. And so bone tissue is constantly being formed and replaced in your body. And the rates at which you deposit new bone matrix compared to the rates at which you eat away bone matrix tells you if your bones are becoming more dense with time or if they're becoming weaker with time. And so here's what this looks like. When we go to classify bones and try to name all these structures, we can start with some really easy stuff, like what is the bone's shape? Okay, now this can get a little confusing, but here's how this works. Long bones, for example, our femur, is longer than it is wide. And that's easy. That's your very stereotypical, cartoon dog bone sort of shape. Now short bones, B, these are shaped a little bit different. They need to be shorter than they are wide. Then we have, and that of course would be one of your ankle bones here. Your flat bones in your skull are, well, they're flat. I don't really know how else to say it. They're flat. That's what they're like. Irregular bones. For D, we pulled a vertebrae. And this vertebrae, is it wide or long or flat? Oh, not really. It's circular. It has a hole in the middle. It has appendages. It has all sorts of stuff. So what do you call it? You call it irregular. There's not an easy way to describe its shape. And then finally we have sesamoid bones. And sesamoid bones, our example here is the patella, and that means it is completely embedded within a tendon. And so there are tendons that run from the femur to the patella, and they cover that patella, and then the patella down to the tibia. And so the patella itself is not really, sitting against any other bones necessarily. It's completely wrapped in a tendon. And so that's one way that we can name some bones based on their shapes or their structures. And that's a good place to start. So now we can look at some of the naming in just one bone. Here we took that same femur from the last slide, and we're going to look at some different structures inside of your typical long bone. So we call this long bone macro anatomy. Okay, microanatomy is what this thing would look like in a microscope, like osteons, canaliculi, that kind of stuff. Macro is big. And so with the naked eye, what can you see about a bone that we can name? And we're going to start here. An epiphysis and a diaphysis. Okay? A diaphysis, which I struggle with. For some reason, I always want to say diaphysis, and I can't because that's wrong. A diaphysis is what's commonly called the shaft of a long bone. It's the long, skinny part of the bone. An epiphysis is this whole end of the bone that has the growth plates in it and that will connect to another bone. Okay, so we separate these out into the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. Now you have to recall from chapter 1 that proximal means closest to the point of attachment, and distal means further away from the point of attachment. And so with a femur, your proximal epiphysis is the part of the femur that connects to the hip, and the distal epiphysis is the part of the femur that would be, I guess, your knee, or connects to the tibia, however you want to say it. So there's proximal and distal, and you will need to know the differences there. So let's look at a few other things before we move on. There is a cavity inside of this bone, and that is called the medullary cavity. Okay, the medullary cavity basically is bone marrow, and I want you to know that bone marrow is inside of this long bone. Here, a lot of it's going to be yellow because these guys aren't making so much for red blood cells. They're more storing fat. Okay. Now, the outside of this bone is very, very strong. It's called compact bone. Okay, and you can tell that the bone cells and the lamellae that they are building out of these inorganic salts are very close together. That's compact bone. That's strength. Now, not all the bone's like that. There's also spongy bone. Up here, you can see that the bone has little cavities all over in it. That gives it the name spongy bone. It's a little less strong as far as supporting weight. And so what we do is we line the outside of that bone with compact bone for strength. And we leave the inside of that bone as spongy. And that allows us to run blood and nerves and all sorts of stuff through there. So we also have articular cartilage, which is a great name. It is this cartilaginous pad right here, and it is the cartilage where we articulate a bone with its neighbor. And so the cartilage where our femur fits into our hip that makes this joint movable and is not grinding bone on bone, which would be a lot of friction. When you wrap it in a smooth cartilage, that reduces that friction. So you can think about that the next time you tear into a chicken leg and you get that kind of shiny, smooth stuff on the end of the chicken leg. So we have a few other terms I want you to know. Endo, within, peri, around, osteo is bone, and so endosteum is a layer of tissue within the bone. Okay, it lines the medullary cavity. Periosteum is a layer of tissue outside of the bone. Okay, these are connective or epithelial tissues rather that line this inside and this outside. And you can feel this. It's not just a dry bone. It is a smooth membrane on the outside of the bone and a smooth membrane on the inside of the bone. And then know that blood and nerves run inside of this medullary cavity, which we sometimes just simplify to say marrow. Cool? So that's your long bone macroanatomy. There is a labeling worksheet for that in our folder, and you can certainly do that. So here's a little nicer picture, that difference between compact and spongy, especially this picture here. Very, very cool. We have this compact bone, which is very dense and very strong. And we have this spongy bone, which has lots of holes in it. And this one has this little remnant of an epiphyseal plate. This has a good picture of epiphyseal plates. Epiphyseal plates are what we commonly call the growth plate. And when you grow, your bones are originally laid down in a blueprint, if you will, of cartilage. Now, as we replace that cartilage with bone, we leave some areas of cartilage all the way up to our teen years. And these are still cartilaginous, and our bone can still grow longer. Now, someday, when you reach, your anatomical adulthood, for a lot of you guys, that's probably about right now, you will stop growing. And you will stop growing because this little line of cartilage becomes bone. And this is now a rigid structure that will not elongate. And so you can call it the growth plate, you can call it the epiphyseal plate, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, when that cartilage turns into bone, you are done growing. So there's the remnant of the epiphyseal plate, much more difficult to see in a real bone than it is on that nice cartoon. All right, and so here's, I already kind of described these to you guys, but here's just a different diagram with it. Articular cartilage right here at the articulation. Looks like we went with a humerus for this diagram. Yeah. The periosteum is the membrane on the outside. Here they've got some blood vessels crawling up it, which is kind of cool. And those blood vessels will actually feed that bone, with nutrients and oxygen. Help form and repair the bone. That periosteum plays a big role in healing a broken bone. It'll form some really cool structures that'll keep that bone safe and heal it up pretty quick. And we'll go over that here a little later. And then we have these periosteal fibers that are continuous with the tendons and the ligaments. And all that really means is that the periosteum is the membrane that allows us to attach a tendon or allows us to attach a ligament. That's where those ligaments actually hook into the bone, is through the periosteum. It gives the ligament something to grab onto. And of course, you'll recall that a ligament attaches a bone to another bone, and a tendon attaches a bone to a muscle. So that takes us to the endosteum, which is the inner layer, the inner membrane I mentioned that lined the medullary cavity. So you could certainly see either of these diagrams on a test, either this one or this one. And you should feel reasonably comfortable in labeling the proximal and the distal epiphysis, the diaphysis, and then, of course, medullary cavities, endosteum, periosteum, and articular cartilage, along with compact and spongy bone. And you should be in pretty good shape for your basic long bone macroanatomy. So the medullary cavity contains bone marrow, which we've talked about already a little bit. If the bone marrow is red in color, it's producing blood cells and platelets. Very important job. If the bone marrow is yellow, it's going to consist mostly of fat. And that's cool because our bones can actually store energy for us if we're starving and we need to draw from fat stores. We can pull it out of our bones. And so here is what this looks like if we zoom in just a little bit. And I like this because it shows the periosteum a little better. Here is the adult bone. We've cut it in half like you might cut down a tree, and you can see a little bit of the microanatomy with these osteons that you guys have seen in Chapter 4's tissues. And you can see where the bone ends. On the outside, our periosteum begins, and there are two layers of this membrane. And the periosteum is lined with this red and blue tubes everywhere, which are, of course, the arteries and the veins, or perhaps arterioles and venules at this point, but they are little blood vessels that you can see here are coming into one of our central canals and feeding blood to all of these bone cells. And all of these canals are interconnected. So it's a very cool diagram for that reason. And then the endosteum, it shows a much more dynamic, honeycombed sort of shape, but it still does have this shiny, I guess you could say smooth membrane on the inside. So that is kind of cool. And then this, of course, is still the medullary cavity. Here's some little perforating canals that run side to side to connect central canals. And the central canals run up and down the middle of an osteon. So altogether, how does blood get to this guy right here? He's going to come in through the periosteum. He's going to get into a central canal. He'll run down until he gets somewhere along the line into a perforating canal, and another perforating canal, and another perforating canal, and another central canal, and he'll end up feeding, one or all of these little osteon central canals. And then the canaliculi will take that blood from there. So bone is not a dry, hard, dead substance. It is a very dynamic, living, responsive organ, and it has blood, and it has nerves, and it senses information, and it's got everything you need to really to be alive, to be a tissue that responds to stress. And that's really a pretty cool feature. So microanatomy, a little bit trickier. We're going to take this big macroanatomy that we just looked at and said this whole thing is, epiphysis, or epiphysis rather, and we're going to zoom way in and say, okay, if we just look at one functional unit of bone's microanatomy, what's that look like? Here's the blood I just showed you coming in through perforating canals and central canals, and that's kind of cool. Now we're going to look at the cells. So the osteon, if you ask, what's the functional unit of bone, living bone tissue, it is the osteon, and that looks like tree rings. We call them concentric layers. Osteocytes are bone cells, and you'll probably recall from Chapter 4 that lamellae are deposited matrix stores in the bone. And so these cells, the osteocytes, will make that bone matrix, and most of your bone is extracellular matrix. So that's kind of a cool deal. So our central canal, we've already seen this fellow right here in the middle, used to be called Haversian canals. We're trying to get away from naming structures after people in anatomy. We're trying to move to naming structures after, some sort of Greek or Latin or their location or something like that. And so this is a hollow tube where new bone cells are deposited. It contains blood vessels. It's longitudinal, which means it runs up and down the femur or up and down a radius, something like that. And these guys are also called Haversian canals. So that's one structure. Let's look at a few others. The perforating canal is horizontal, this fellow right here. He connects the two central canals. They're communication passageways because they transport blood and nerves. The nerve is the yellow here, very closely neighboring the artery, and the vein runs this little yellow nerve. And these used to be called Volkmann's canals. You can just learn them as perforating canals. Sorry about that. Osteocyte, I want you to know that is a bone cell. These little dark spots in here are lacunae. And each lacunae, here we got a little better picture down here. Each lacunae contains a very small osteocyte. But most of the space in here is bone matrix. This is all bone matrix. That's one lacunae. And that little tiny purple dot is one osteocyte in the lacunae. And so osteocytes have the odd job of building matrix until they literally entomb themselves within their own matrix, and that's how bone is built. So there are two types of osteocytes you need to know, because we can't leave it as simple as just bone cells, of course. There are osteoblasts, which build new bone, and there are osteoclasts, which eat away bone matrix. And so these two forces are sort of working against each other all the time. Osteoblasts are building new bone material. Osteoclasts are destroying bone material. And it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. If you have a lot of calcium in your blood, you will deposit more new bone material than you will break down. If you don't have enough calcium and phosphorus in your blood, you will break down more bone matrix than you deposit. And you will free up calcium and phosphorus and magnesium into your bloodstream to be used in other organs and organ systems. Cool? So these two are constantly working against each other. And the bad thing is as you age, these fellows right here start to slow down a little bit. And you end up looking at all sorts of different things like osteoporosis and bones becoming less dense and breaks becoming more common and healing becoming slower, etc., etc. So while you are young, by all means, drink lots of calcium, run and exercise and do those sorts of things, because you will certainly deposit a more dense bone to start with. So the last thing we have here, which we've already talked about a little bit, is our lacunae. Lacunae, the little lake, the little space, it's a space in the matrix that holds the teeny tiny osteocyte. Cool? That is bone microanatomy. And so here you have our matrix, which we're going to show you. I think this picture might be a little bit better for matrix. All of this yellow here is all bone matrix. And we give bone matrix its own special name. We call it lamellae. It's composed of collagen, which is kind of cool if you think about that, because you've already learned about collagen. Collagen is actually rather flexible. But the inorganic salts really gives it a lot of the hard, rigid strength that you normally think of bone as having. But really, it's made up of enough collagen that bone, when it's this is a weird word to say for it, but fresh, it's actually got a little flex. It's got a little give in bone. It doesn't just shatter or break real easy. It has a little bit of ability to flex and withstand some pressures, right? So collagen is going to make bone very strong and just a tiny bit flexible, and those inorganic salts are going to make bone very hard and resist crushing. You don't want to crush a bone. Okay, we can break a bone, but crushing a bone, it can be pretty bad for that limb. And so inorganic salts will allow us to do things like pick up very heavy weights, hopefully without the bones crushing under our weight. So a few other terms: canaliculus, or plural canaliculi. These are passageways between osteocytes. So again, I still kind of like this picture better. Osteocyte, lacunae, canaliculus, 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 canaliculi, new lacunae, new osteocyte. And then we have trabeculae. And trabeculae, which is a term you'll actually see again when we study the heart, so that's kind of cool. Trabeculae is this honeycomb matrix on the inside. It's kind of the name of this shape we get that looks like a honeycomb on the inside, and that's where we see our spongy bone. So with that, we did macroanatomy and microanatomy in one lecture. It's a lot of new terms. It's a lot to kind of work over in your brain. So we're going to stop there. There are a couple of worksheets over micro and macroanatomy in the folder. Please take your time, practice labeling these, and give your brain a break before you jump into the next one, because we covered a lot of new vocab today. So thanks for your